They say Kang Minyi has a heart of flint, cold, hard, and incapable of a spark. For 3 years, he watched his maid, Zara Akoy, move through his halls like a ghost. He knew the way she took her coffee, the way she hummed when she thought he wasn't listening, and the way he had to clench his fists to keep from reaching out to her. He was the boss, she was off limits. Then came the night the rain tried to wash away the sins of the city. Through the downpour, a flash of white lace appeared, Zara, dressed in a wedding gown that looked more like a shroud, running from the man who bought her. Behind her, the headlights of Dominic Vale's SUVs cut through the dark like predator eyes. She didn't have a weapon, only the hope that the man she'd served for years might finally serve justice. When she collapsed at his feet, Minyi didn't just help her up. He drew his weapon and stood between her and the world. For the first time in his life, the boss didn't care about the rules. He cared about his woman. Minyi almost lost the woman he loved because he was too proud to speak up for 3 long years. Now, Zara is running for her life in a wedding dress that feels like a burial shroud. How will you feel losing someone you love because you're too afraid to say how you really feel? Drop your answer in the comment. Before we proceed with the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment, and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's dive into the story. The silence within the Minyi estate wasn't the empty kind. It was heavy, pressurized, and layered with things left unsaid. For 3 years, Zara Akoy had moved through the vast, marble-cold corridors of the mansion like a ghost haunting a fortress. To the outside world, Kang Minyi was a titan of the underworld, a man whose name was whispered with a shudder and whose gaze could freeze the blood in a man's veins. But to Zara, he was the man who drank his coffee black at 5:00 a.m., the man who preferred the scent of sandalwood over expensive cologne, and the man who, for 1,095 days, had never once raised his voice to her. Her life was measured in the small, repetitive rituals of service. She polished the mahogany desk where he signed orders that moved millions. She ironed the crisp, white shirts that draped over his powerful, tattooed shoulders, and she learned the exact angle at which he liked his morning paper placed. She was the help. She was invisible. Or at least, that was the lie they both told themselves to keep the world from spinning out of control. Minyi was a man of absolute discipline. He had to be. In his line of work, a single slip of the heart was a death sentence. He had watched Zara from the moment she arrived, a young woman with eyes too bright for the dim, violent world he inhabited. He noticed the way she hummed Yoruba folk songs while she dusted the library, a sound that seemed to pull the tension right out of his spine. He noticed the way she'd pause by the floor-to-ceiling windows when it rained, her silhouette framed against the gray Atlanta sky, looking as though she were dreaming of a place far away from the blood and the business. There were moments, tiny, flickering sparks, where the distance between master and maid threatened to collapse. Once, while she was serving him dinner in the flickering candlelight of the formal dining room, her hand had brushed his as she set down a crystal glass. The contact was brief, a mere second of skin against skin, but the air in the room had instantly vanished. Minyi's hand had tensed, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to catch her wrist and pull her closer, but his face remained a mask of stone. Zara had felt the heat of him, a searing contrast to the cold life she led, and she had retreated into the shadows with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Another time, he had returned late, his suit jacket stained with a dark splash of red that wasn't wine. He had found her in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea in the moonlight. He didn't order her to bed. Instead, he sat at the kitchen island, his tall, grounded frame looking strangely vulnerable in the dim light. Zara didn't ask questions. She simply moved. She brought a warm cloth and a basin of water, kneeling beside him to clean the grime and shadow from his knuckles. He had watched her then, his sharp, alert gaze softening into something that looked dangerously like longing. He hadn't said thank you. Mafia bosses didn't thank their maids. But he had stayed perfectly still, letting her touch him in a way no one else was allowed to. But the silence was his shield. He knew the monsters that circled his life. He knew that to claim her was to mark her, and he cared for her too much to let his darkness touch her. So he watched her through the security cameras, he listened for her footsteps in the hall, and he kept his feelings locked behind the iron doors of his soul. Zara, too, played her part. She knew she shouldn't look at him for more than a second. She knew the danger that radiated from him like a physical heat. Yet, she found herself lingering in his office long after the cleaning was done, inhaling the scent of his cigars and the leather of his chair. She saw the loneliness in the way he stood on the balcony, a king with a kingdom of shadows but no one to share the light with. She wanted to tell him that she saw him, not the boss, not the killer, but the man. Then, the outside world finally broke through the walls of the estate. The letters from her father had started coming, desperate, frantic pleas about debts that couldn't be paid and a family name that was crumbling. And then came the ultimatum, the marriage to Dominic Vale. For 3 years, Minnie had been her silent protector, a man who kept her safe by keeping her at a distance. He had seen the light in her eyes begin to dim as the wedding date approached. He had seen her hands shake as she served his coffee, and he had seen the bruises on her spirit even if no one had touched her body yet. He wanted to scream at her to stay, to tell her that he would pay every debt 10 times over just to keep her in his house. But he remained silent, trapped by the code of a world that didn't allow for a maid to be a queen. On her last day at the estate, as she packed her small suitcase, the silence was deafening. She had stood in the doorway of his study, waiting for a sign, a word, a reason to turn back. Minnie had looked at her, his jaw firm, his expression sharp and alert, but his eyes were a storm of unspoken grief. He let her walk out. He watched the tail lights of her car vanish down the driveway, believing that his silence was the ultimate gift of freedom. He didn't know then that the man she was going to was a monster worse than any he had faced in the underworld. He didn't know that by letting her go to save her, he had nearly delivered her to her grave. But as the rain began to fall on the night of her wedding, the 3 years of silence were about to end in a roar of gunfire and a love that could no longer be contained. The transition from the sanctuary of the Minyi estate to the ancestral home of the Akoi family felt like stepping out of a dream and into a cold, clinical nightmare. Zara had arrived expecting a reconciliation, a way to help her father navigate the financial ruins of his shipping empire. Instead, she found a house filled with the scent of lilies and the suffocating presence of a man who looked at the world as though he already owned it. Dominic Vale didn't just walk into a room. He occupied it, his presence a predatory weight that made the air feel thin. Her father, a man once proud and formidable, wouldn't look her in the eye. He stood by the window of his study, his shoulders slumped as he explained the merger that would save their family name. It wasn't a partnership, it was a bill of sale. To satisfy the mounting debts and the failed investments, Zara was to be the collateral. The man standing at the mahogany desk, swirling a glass of amber scotch, was her buyer. Dominic Vale was the antithesis of the quiet, disciplined power she had grown used to in Minyi's house. Where Minyi was a blade hidden in velvet, Dominic was a sledgehammer. He was handsome in a way that felt sharp and artificial, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, which remained as flat and predatory as a shark's. He moved toward her, his custom-tailored suit straining against a frame built for intimidation. When he finally spoke, his voice was a smooth, cultured purr that set every nerve in Zara's body on edge. "I've heard so much about your loyalty, Zara," Dominic murmured, stopping just inches from her. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive entitlement that made her skin crawl. A woman who can spend 3 years in the house of a beast like Kang Minyi and come out with her secrets intact is exactly the kind of asset I need at my side. He didn't speak of love or even a future. He spoke of assets and acquisitions. To Dominic, the upcoming wedding wasn't a union of souls, but a trophy ceremony. He took delight in the way she flinched, his eyes darkening with a sadistic flicker of satisfaction. He was a man who thrived on breaking things, and in Zara, he saw the ultimate challenge, a woman whose spirit had been forged in the fire of the city's most dangerous man. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were a blurred montage of silk fittings and forced smiles. Zara was a prisoner in her own home, guarded by Dominic's men, who lacked the silent professionalism of Minyi's soldiers. These men were loud, crude, and watched her with eyes that suggested they were only waiting for Dominic to be finished with her. Every night, she lay awake, the silence of her room feeling wrong without the distant, comforting hum of the Minyi estate. She thought of the boss, wondering if he even knew what he had sent her back to. She wondered if he was sitting in his office, drinking his black coffee, oblivious to the fact that the ghost who used to hum in his library was being fitted for a cage. The betrayal hit its peak on the morning of the wedding. Her mother, draped in expensive lace bought with Dominic's money, handed Zara a velvet box containing a diamond necklace that felt like a collar. "It's for the best, Zara," her mother whispered, refusing to meet her gaze. "He's a powerful man. He can provide what we no longer can." "He's a monster," Zara had replied, her voice a hollow rasp. "In this world, darling, we marry monsters so we don't get eaten by them." But as Zara stood before the mirror in her $20,000 wedding gown, the delicate lace contrasting sharply with the cold terror in her heart, she knew she couldn't go through with it. The dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk, shimmering under the vanity lights, but to Zara, it felt like a shroud. She looked at her reflection, the wide, startled eyes, the wet strands of hair clinging to her forehead from the humidity of her own panic. She realized then that Dominic Vale didn't want a wife. He wanted a victim to display. The ceremony was held at an exclusive estate on the outskirts of Atlanta, a sprawling property surrounded by high gates and armed security. As the music began to play and the guests turned to watch the beautiful bride walk down the aisle, Zara saw Dominic standing at the altar. He looked at her not with affection, but with the cold triumph of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. The way he adjusted his cufflinks, the way he straightened his shoulders, it was all a performance of dominance. The vows felt like a death sentence being read aloud. Every word Dominic spoke was a claim, a marking of territory. When the officiant asked if she took this man to be her husband, the silence stretched for an agonizing heartbeat. Her father's hand tightened on her arm, a silent, desperate plea to save the family. She whispered the words, her voice barely audible over the sudden roll of thunder outside. But as Dominic leaned in to kiss her, a kiss that tasted of scotch and victory, Zara made a silent vow of her own. She would not be his trophy. She would not be broken. The rain began to lash against the stained glass windows, a violent omen of the storm brewing within her. She had spent 3 years learning from a man who knew how to wage war, and as the reception began and the first chance for escape presented itself, Zara Akoy decided it was time to put those lessons to use. The heavy, humid air of the reception hall felt like a physical weight against Zara's chest, the scent of expensive lilies now smelling like the rot of a funeral. Dominic Vale stood at the center of a circle of powerful men, his hand possessively anchored to the small of her back as if he were branding her. He was distracted, laughing at a joke made by a senator, his ego inflated by the champagne and the victory of the night. Zara knew this was her only window, the narrow gap between being a trophy and being a prisoner. When Dominic finally turned to take a flute of champagne from a passing waiter, Zara leaned in, her voice a practiced whisper of submission. She told him she needed a moment to adjust her veil, to breathe away the dizzying heat of the room. He looked at her, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of defiance, but she gave him only the wide-eyed, startled expression of a girl overwhelmed by his shadow. He let her go with a sharp nod, a silent warning that his men were watching every exit. But Dominic's men didn't know the Zara who had spent 3 years navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Minyi estate. They saw a fragile bride in a heavy gown. They didn't see the woman who had learned the cadence of security patrols and the blind spots of cameras from the most disciplined man in the city. She moved toward the powder room, but the moment she turned the corner, she ditched the high-heeled silk pumps that made her walk a target. Barefoot, she sprinted toward the kitchen, her breath hitching as she ducked behind a row of industrial refrigerators. The staff was too busy with the 12-course meal to notice a flash of white lace disappearing through the service entrance. The moment the heavy steel door clicked shut behind her, the Atlanta sky opened up. The rain was sudden and violent, turning the pristine ivory of her gown into a leaden weight within seconds. Zara didn't care. She ran. Her feet slapped against the wet pavement of the service alley, the delicate lace of her train catching on a rusted dumpster, tearing with a sound like a scream. She didn't look back. Behind her, the muffled sound of music was replaced by the roar of the storm and the sudden, distant shout of a man realizing his prize was gone. The city was a blur of neon and shadow. The designer wedding dress, $12,000 of silk and her family's broken dreams, was now ripped and muddy, clinging to her dark skin like a shroud. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. Behind her, the low, predatory growl of a car engine rose above the thunder. Headlights cut through the dark, twin eyes of fire reflecting in the black mirrors of the rain-slicked streets. Dominic's men. They weren't just looking for her, they were hunting her. To Dominic, this wasn't just a runaway bride. This was a public humiliation, a debt that could only be paid in blood. Zara lunged into a narrow industrial district, her lungs burning, the cold rain stinging her eyes. She felt the vibration of the pursuit in the very soles of her feet. Every alley looked the same, a maze of industrial decay and flickering signs. She was losing time. She was losing her breath. Her silhouette was too bright, too visible against the grime of the warehouse district. Just as the black SUV rounded the corner, its tires screeching against the asphalt, Zara saw a familiar glow in the distance. A neon lotus flower, flickering blue and red against the industrial gloom. The Lotus Club. It was a place of dangerous men and dark business, a place she knew Minyi frequented when he didn't want to be found. It was a lion's den, but behind her was a monster who would break her piece by piece. She made a choice. She burst onto the main thoroughfare, her dress a sodden mess, her hair plastered to her face in wild strands. The SUV was closing in, the tinted window rolling down to reveal the glint of a weapon. Zara didn't stop. She threw herself toward the entrance of the club just as a sleek black sedan pulled to a sudden, violent halt in front of the doors. The door of the sedan swung open, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Standing there, tall and physically grounded in a fitted black suit weathered by the rain, was Kang Minyi. His posture was angled forward like a shield, his expression sharp and alert. He didn't look at the wedding dress with confusion. He looked at Zara with a fierce, protective vigilance that signaled he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Minyi," she gasped, her voice breaking as she collapsed toward him, her hands clutching at his damp lapels. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into the line of fire, one arm extending protectively across her, pulling her small, shaking frame into the solid heat of his body. His gaze was directed outward, scanning the approaching SUV with a calm power that made the air around them feel still despite the storm. Behind them, the SUV screeched to a halt, but the men inside didn't move. Even Dominic's most hardened enforcers knew the man in the rain. They knew the tattoos visible near his neck and the disciplined, ruthless persona of the man who had finally stopped hiding his feelings. Zara felt the tension in his muscles, the readiness of a predator about to strike. For 3 years, she had been his maid, a ghost in his house. But as he shielded her from the world, the look in his eyes told her that the time for silence was over. The runaway bride had found the only man in the city dangerous enough to keep her. The metal of the black sedan was cold, but the man holding Zara was a furnace of steady, controlled heat. Minyi didn't ask her how she had gotten there, or why she was shivering in a ruined wedding gown. He simply tucked her behind the heavy shield of his body, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. The gesture was a silent reclamation, a promise that the 3 years of distance had officially come to an end. Across the rain-slicked pavement, the black SUV hissed to a halt. The headlights cut through the downpour like twin blades, illuminating the spray of water kicked up by the wind. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic rhythm of Zara's heart and the rhythmic click-click-click of the sedan's cooling engine. Then, the heavy door of the SUV swung open. Dominic Vale stepped out, his movements jagged and furious, a sharp contrast to the motionless silhouette of the man standing before him. Dominic's expensive tuxedo was damp, his hair disheveled, but his eyes were wide with a manic, possessive rage. He stopped several feet away, his gaze darting from Zara's terrified face to Minyi's impassive mask. Behind Dominic, 4 enforcers emerged from the vehicle, their hands hovering near the waistbands of their slacks, a clear threat of the violence they were prepared to unleash. "Minyi," Dominic spat, the name sounding like a curse. "You're overstepping. That woman belongs to me. We have a contract. We have a vow." Minyi didn't move. He stood tall, his feet planted firmly on the wet asphalt, his posture reflecting the grounded authority of a man who had survived 1,000 storms. He looked at Dominic not with fear, but with a chilling, clinical observation. "She's not a contract, Dominic," Minyi's voice was low, carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very air. And she certainly doesn't belong to a man who has to hunt her through the mud to keep her. Dominic took a step forward, his jaw tight. She was your maid, a servant. You let her go. Don't tell me the ruthless Kang Minyi has developed a conscience for a girl who used to polish his floors. The insult hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Zara felt Minyi's muscles tighten beneath his suit jacket, but his voice remained as calm as the eye of a hurricane. She was never just a maid. She was a guest in my house, and now she is under my protection. If you want her, you'll have to go through the man who knows exactly what she's worth. Dominic's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. He signaled to his men, and the click of safeties being disengaged echoed through the alleyway. You're outnumbered, Minyi. You're alone in the rain with a girl who's more trouble than she's worth. Give her to me, and I might forget you interfered. In response, the shadows of the industrial district seemed to come alive. From the dark recesses of the Lotus Club's loading docks and the nearby alleyways, a dozen men appeared. They moved with the silent, disciplined precision that was the hallmark of the Korean underworld. They didn't shout. They simply formed a semicircle around Minyi and Zara, their weapons drawn and aimed with lethal intent. The standoff was a masterclass in tension. On one side, the chaotic, desperate aggression of a man losing his prize. On the other, the cold, calculated power of a boss protecting his heart. The rain intensified, blurring the lines between the two factions, but the visual remained clear. Minyi was the immovable object, and Dominic was the force that was about to break against him. You think you can hide behind your soldiers? Dominic hissed, though his bravado was visibly wavering as he realized the tide had turned. I'm not hiding, Minyi said, finally shifting his gaze directly into Dominic's eyes. He reached back, his fingers interlacing with Zara's trembling ones, anchoring her to him. I'm ending this. If you or your men take one more step toward this woman, I will consider it an act of war against my family. And you know how I handle my enemies, Dominic. The threat was implicit and absolute. Dominic looked at the armed men surrounding him, then back at Zara, who was looking at Minyi with a mixture of shock and burgeoning hope. The realization hit Dominic like a physical blow. He hadn't just lost a bride. He had challenged the one man in Atlanta who could systematically dismantle his entire life. This isn't over, Dominic growled, though he was already backing toward his SUV. She's an Akoi. Her father will hear about this. Tell him, Minyi replied, his voice a cold finality. And tell him that if he wants to talk about his daughter's future, he talks to me. As the SUV screeched into a desperate U-turn and vanished into the curtain of rain, Minyi didn't relax. He waited until the sound of the engine faded before turning to Zara. The sharp, alert expression softened as he looked down at her. He didn't speak. He simply reached up, his thumb brushing a smudge of mud from her cheek with a tenderness that contradicted his ruthless persona. In that moment, the shield became a sanctuary. The 3 years of silence had been replaced by a roar of protection, and as he led her toward the warmth of the club, Zara knew she wasn't just escaping a marriage, she was finally coming home. The heavy iron gates of the Minyi estate swung open with a low, mechanical hum, but as the sedan rolled up the familiar driveway, the air felt fundamentally different. For 3 years, Zara had entered this property through the service gate, a ghost in a uniform. Now, as Minyi brought the car to a halt directly in front of the grand entrance, she was wrapped in his oversized suit jacket, the scent of sandalwood and rain clinging to her skin. Minyi didn't wait for his security team to approach. He moved with a restless, protective energy, rounding the car and opening Zara's door before anyone else could touch the handle. When he reached for her, it wasn't the distant, professional gesture of a master helping a servant. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, her sodden wedding gown draping over his forearms like a fallen flag. I can walk, Minyi, she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion and the lingering chill of the storm. You've run enough for one night, he replied, his jaw set in that familiar, firm line. Tonight you rest. He carried her through the foyer, past the polished mahogany and the marble statues she had dusted 1,000 times. The staff stood in the shadows, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and reverence. They saw the blood on his knuckles and the ruined silk of her dress, but most of all, they saw the way he held her, as if she were the only fragile thing in a world made of stone. He didn't take her to the servants' quarters in the East Wing. Instead, he ascended the grand staircase toward the private master's suite, a floor she had only ever entered to clean, never to stay. He set her down in the center of a room that smelled of cedar and leather. It was a masculine sanctuary, dimly lit and imposing, but tonight it felt like a fortress. "The guest rooms are being prepared, but you'll stay here tonight," he said, his voice dropping to a low, grounded vibration. "My men are stationed at every door. Dominic Vale wouldn't make it past the tree line." Zara stood in the center of the plush rug, her bare feet sinking into the fibers. She felt exposed, the torn lace of her gown a reminder of the asset she was supposed to be. The silence that had once been comfortable between them was now charged with a new, agonizing tension. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer his maid, but she wasn't yet sure who she was to him. "Why?" she asked, the word hanging in the air between them. "Why risk a war with Dominic for a maid you let go weeks ago?" Minyi stopped his movement toward the wardrobe. He turned, the sharp, alert gaze softening just enough to let her see the fire beneath the ice. He walked toward her, stopping just at the edge of her personal space. The height difference between them was staggering, his physically grounded frame casting a long shadow over her. "I didn't let you go because I wanted to, Zara," he said, his voice raw. "I let you go because I thought I was the monster in your story. I thought if I kept my feelings hidden, I was keeping you clean. I was wrong. I watched you leave this house and realized that the silence I kept for 3 years was just a different kind of prison." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he finally allowed his fingers to graze her temple, tucking a wet strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a searing contrast to the cold rain. "You were never just the maid, Zara. You were the only reason I came home." The confession shattered the last of the professional distance. Zara looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the subtle tattoos near his neck, the mark of a hardened past, and the disciplined presence of a man who had spent his life in control. But in his eyes, she saw a vulnerability that he had never shown the world. "I spent 3 years wondering if you even knew I was in the room," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I used to linger in your office just to breathe the same air. I thought I was invisible to you." Minyi's hand moved to the back of her neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin there. "I knew every time you entered a room. I knew the sound of your breathing. I knew when you were happy and when you were scared. And seeing you in that dress, running from that man, it was the first time in my life I truly felt fear." The tension in the room wasn't just about the war outside. It was about the years of repressed longing finally boiling to the surface. Minyi pulled back slightly, his expression returning to that of the vigilant protector. "There is a robe in the bathroom. The water is hot. Clean the rain off your skin, Zara. Tomorrow we deal with your father and Dominic, but tonight you are safe. You are home." As he turned to leave the room to give her privacy, Zara realized the transformation had already begun. She wasn't the girl who polished the floors anymore, and he wasn't just the boss. They were two people who had survived the silence, and as she watched him close the heavy oak door, she knew that the sanctuary of the estate was no longer about the walls. It was about the man standing guard outside them. The storm outside had settled into a rhythmic, melancholic hum against the reinforced glass of the master's suite, but inside, the air was thick with a tension that felt far more volatile. Zara emerged from the steam-filled bathroom, wrapped in a heavy, charcoal-gray silk robe that belonged to Minyi. It was miles too large, the hem pooling around her ankles and the sleeves swallowed her hands, yet the weight of it felt like the first real protection she'd known in weeks. Minyi was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room. He had changed into a simple black t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders, his silhouette a dark, immovable pillar against the flickering lights of the city below. He didn't turn when she entered, but his posture shifted, a subtle, alert grounding that told her he was acutely aware of her presence. "I had the kitchen prepare something," he said, his voice low and raspy, cutting through the silence. "You haven't eaten." Zara didn't look at the tray on the table. She looked at him, the physically grounded man who had just declared war on a billionaire for her. "I don't think I can eat, Minyi. Not until I understand what's happening. Not until I know why the man who barely looked at me for 3 years is suddenly acting like I'm the most important person in his empire." Finally, he turned. The sharp, disciplined presence was still there, but in the dim light of the room, the mask was slipping. His eyes, usually scanning for danger with cold precision, were now fixed on her with a raw intensity that made her breath hitch. He walked toward her, each step measured, until he was standing close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his skin. "You think I didn't look at you?" he asked, a ghost of a bitter smile playing on his lips. "Zara, I looked at you every single day. I looked at you until it became a habit I couldn't break. I looked at you until the sound of your footsteps in the hall was the only thing that could settle the noise in my head." He reached out, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly before he tucked a dry strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered there, his thumb grazing the line of her cheek. "You were the maid. You were the help. And I told myself that as long as I kept you in that box, you were safe. I told myself that if I never spoke your name with the hunger I felt, the monsters I live with would never notice you." Zara searched his face, seeing the cracks in the ice she had thought was permanent. "You loved me, all that time." "Wasn't just love," he confessed, his voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper. "It was an obsession I had to hide even from myself. Every time you hummed those songs in the library, I wanted to walk in and tell you to never stop. Every time I saw you look at the rain, I wanted to promise you a world where you'd never have to feel the cold again. But I'm a man built for war, Zara. My hands are stained with things you shouldn't even know exist. I thought that by staying silent, I was being your hero. I thought I was giving you a chance at a normal life." He pulled back slightly, his expression hardening with a flash of self-loathing. "Then I saw you in that dress. I saw you running from Dominic Vale, a man who is a monster in a way I could never be because he hides his cruelty behind a suit and a smile. I realized then that my silence hadn't saved you. It had nearly destroyed you." The vulnerability in his confession was staggering. This was the first break in the ruthless exterior that the entire underworld feared. Minyi, the Ice King of the Atlanta crime families, was standing in his own bedroom, admitting that his greatest tactical error was his own heart. Zara reached up, her smaller, dark hand covering his on her cheek. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I spent 3 years feeling like a shadow. I spent 3 years thinking I was a fool for falling for a man who didn't know I existed." Minyi's eyes widened, a flicker of shock crossing his disciplined features. You felt it too." "How could I not?" Zara said, a small, sad laugh escaping her. "You were the only person who ever truly saw me, even when you weren't looking. You created a world where I felt safe, even if it was a lie. I didn't want a normal life, Minyi. I wanted this one with you." The tension that had built up over 3 years of silence finally snapped. Minyi didn't wait for another word. He leaned down, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that was 3 years in the making. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, hungry reclamation. It tasted of sandalwood, rain, and the fierce, protective love that had finally found its voice. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, his breathing ragged. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who was ready to burn the world down to keep the woman in his arms. "Dominic Vale is going to come for you," Minyi said, his voice returning to that sharp, alert vibration, but this time it was laced with a new kind of promise. "He thinks he bought a wife. He's about to find out he declared war on the wrong man. You aren't going back, Zara. Not to him, not to your father, and not to the kitchen. From this moment on, you sit beside me." As the realization of her new reality settled in, Zara felt a surge of power she had never known. The runaway maid was gone. The runaway bride was a memory. Standing in the arms of the man who had secretly loved her through the silence, she knew that the real story was only just beginning. The piece of the Minyi estate was a fragile glass dome, and it shattered exactly 48 hours after the storm. Dominic Vale was not a man who accepted loss. He was a man who burned the board when he couldn't win the game. By Monday morning, the digital and physical worlds collided in a coordinated assault designed to strip Minyi of his power and Zara of her newfound sanctuary. It began with the screens. Every major news outlet and social media platform was flooded with leaked footage and doctored narratives. Dominic's PR machine, fueled by millions, painted a story of a distraught, kidnapped bride held against her will by a violent criminal syndicate. Zara's own father appeared on a national news segment, his face a mask of coached grief, begging for the safe return of his daughter from the clutches of the ruthless Kang Minyi. To the public, it was a tragedy. To the underworld, it was a neon sign inviting federal scrutiny onto Minyi's operations. Minyi stood in his command center, the glow of a dozen monitors reflecting in his sharp, alert eyes. He didn't pace. He didn't shout. He stood with the terrifying stillness of a predator watching a fire approach his den. Zara stood beside him, her hands trembling as she watched her father's betrayal loop on a 24-hour news cycle. She felt the weight of the suit jacket she wore, Minyi's jacket, and realized that Dominic wasn't just trying to get her back. He was trying to delete her autonomy by making her a victim in the eyes of the law. "He's trying to force your hand," Zara whispered, her voice tight with guilt. "If the police come here, you can't fight them the way you fought Dominic in the rain." "He thinks he can use the light to smoke me out of the shadows," Minyi replied, his voice a low, grounded vibration. He turned to her, his hand reaching out to squeeze her shoulder, his thumb stroking the base of her neck in a gesture of absolute possession. "But he forgets that I built this empire in the dark. I am not a victim of his headlines, Zara, and neither are you." The psychological warfare was only the first wave. By noon, the physical hit began. It wasn't a direct assault on the estate, Dominic wasn't that foolish, but a systematic dismantling of Minyi's logistics. 3 of his primary shipping warehouses in the industrial district were hit simultaneously. It wasn't the police, it was a mercenary group, high-end cleaners hired by Dominic to cripple Minyi's revenue. Explosions rocked the docks, the orange glow visible even from the estate's high vantage point. The reports came in fast. Supply chains severed, security teams pinned down, and millions of dollars in cargo incinerated. It was a clear message from the tycoon. "I will bankrupt you, I will jail you, and I will take back what I paid for." The tension in the house reached a fever pitch. Minyi's captains, men who had served him for a decade, looked to him with expectation. They wanted blood. They wanted to hit back. But Minyi remained disciplined, his gaze directed outward, scanning the chess board for the move Dominic hadn't seen coming. "He's overextending," Minyi said, more to himself than to the room. He walked to the center of the office, his presence physically grounded and commanding. "Dominic is a businessman who thinks he's a general. He's spending a fortune to create a spectacle because he knows he can't win a war of attrition against me." Zara watched him, seeing the hardened past reflected in the subtle tattoos near his hand as he gripped the edge of his desk. She realized then that her flaw, her belief that she was a burden, was exactly what Dominic was trying to exploit. He wanted her to feel so much guilt for Minyi's losses that she would walk back to him voluntarily to make the pain stop. "He wants me to break," Zara said, her voice growing stronger as she stepped closer to Minyi. "He thinks if he destroys everything you've built, I'll crawl back to save you." Minyi looked at her, the sharp expression softening into a look of fierce pride. "Then he doesn't know you, and he certainly doesn't know me. I've lived with nothing before, Zara. I can lose every warehouse I own, but as long as you are standing behind these gates, he hasn't taken a single thing that matters." But the final blow of the afternoon was personal. A courier arrived at the main gate under a white flag, delivering a single, handwritten note from Dominic. It wasn't addressed to Minyi, it was for Zara. "I have your brother, Zara. The debt must be paid. You have until midnight to return to the altar, or he pays for your wedding in blood." The silence that followed the reading of the note was deafening. The Ice King's mask didn't just crack, it vanished. A dark, terrifying energy radiated from Minyi, his jaw firming into a line of pure lethality. He didn't look at the note. He looked at the clock. "He's moved from business to family," Minyi whispered, the tone of his voice promising a slaughter. "That was his last mistake." Zara felt the shift in the air. The sanctuary of the safe house was gone, replaced by the war room of a man who no longer cared about the rules. Dominic Vale had launched a smear campaign and a physical hit, but he had forgotten the one rule of the underworld: never threaten what a mafia boss loves. As Minyi began to bark orders to his men, Zara realized the 3 years of silence were about to be replaced by a night of absolute, unmitified chaos. The sirens of the city felt worlds away as the true storm descended upon the Minyi estate. Dominic Vale hadn't waited for the midnight deadline. He was a man who played with fire, and he had brought the embers of his rage to Minyi's front door. The assault was clinical, a brutal orchestration of flashbangs and heavy-caliber gunfire that shattered the rhythmic silence of the night. Inside the command center, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and gunpowder. Minyi moved with the lethal efficiency Zara had only ever glimpsed in the shadows. He was no longer the man who drank coffee in a silent kitchen. He was a titan of war, barking orders into a radio, his eyes scanning the security monitors with a sharp, alert focus. He had handed Zara a sleek, compact firearm, the weight of it cold and terrifying in her hand. "Stay behind the reinforced glass," he commanded, his voice a low, grounded vibration that brooked no argument. "If they breach this room, you don't hesitate. You're not a maid tonight, Zara. You're the one who survives." But the tactical advantage shifted when a breach team detonated a charge at the secondary entrance. The explosion rocked the foundation of the house, throwing Minyi against a marble pillar. Zara screamed as a spray of debris filled the air. Through the dust, she saw him, Dominic's lead mercenary, a shadow in tactical gear, leveling a rifle at the man who had protected her for 3 years. Minyi reacted with a speed that defied his grounded stature, drawing his sidearm and firing, but a round caught him in the shoulder. He buckled, his black t-shirt blooming with a sudden, dark wetness. He didn't cry out, but the physical grounding that usually defined him faltered. He slumped against the pillar, his breath hitching as he struggled to raise his weapon again. Dominic Vale stepped through the settling dust, his expensive shoes crunching on the glass of his own making. He looked at Minyi with a terrifying, hollow triumph. "I told you she was an acquisition, Minyi. You bled for a servant. Was it worth the empire?" Zara felt the panic rise, a cold tide threatening to drown her. She looked at Minyi, whose eyes were fixed on her, even as the light in them seemed to flicker. He was wounded, his ruthless exterior finally broken by a leaden reality. This was the moment she had feared, the moment her presence became the death of the man she loved. Then something in her snapped. The 3 years of silence, the weeks of running, the fear of the monster. It all burned away, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. She wasn't the distraught bride Dominic's PR machine had created. She was the woman who knew every inch of this house, every shadow Minyi had ever stood in. As Dominic raised his own gold-plated pistol to finish the job, Zara stepped out from the reinforced glass. Her posture was tense, her shoulders raised, and her hands clutched the weapon with an urgency that signaled she was no longer seeking protection. She was providing it. "Drop it, Dominic," she said, her voice a hard, steady rasp that cut through the ringing in the room. Dominic laughed, a sharp, artificial sound. "You can't even hold that thing straight, Zara. Come back to me and I'll let him die quickly. It's the only way to save your brother." "My brother is already safe," Zara replied, her eyes narrowing as she recalled the message Minyi had whispered to his captains minutes before the breach. "Your men are loyal to money, Dominic. Minyi's men are loyal to him. The extraction happened 10 minutes ago. You have nothing left." The realization hit Dominic like a physical blow. His face contorted into a mask of pure, sadistic rage. But as he turned his aim toward her, Zara didn't flinch. She remembered the way Minyi had stood in the rain, his body angled forward like a shield. She mirrored him now. She pulled the trigger. The recoil sent a jolt through her arms, but her aim was true. The round didn't kill him. She wasn't a murderer. But it shattered the marble floor at his feet, sending a spray of stone into his face. In that heartbeat of distraction, Minyi found the strength to surge forward. Despite the wound in his shoulder, he tackled Dominic with the raw power of a man who had finally found something worth more than his life. The struggle was brief and brutal. Minyi didn't use a gun. He used his hands, the hardened past visible in the way he pinned the tycoon to the floor. When he finally stepped back, Dominic was a broken, sobbing mess, the tycoon reduced to a coward in the mud. Minyi turned to Zara, his face weathered by the rain of sweat and debris. He was bleeding, his physical strength spent, but the look he gave her was one of absolute, luminous reverence. He didn't see a maid or a bride. He saw his partner. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice a ragged shadow of its usual command. Zara dropped the gun and ran to him, catching him as he finally allowed his knees to hit the floor. She wrapped her arms around him, the delicate lace of her sleeve, now stained with his blood, intertwining with his dark tattoos. "I told you," she said, her forehead resting against his. "I didn't want a normal life, I wanted this one." The final confrontation at the estate ended not with the fall of an empire, but with the birth of a new one. As Minyi's men moved in to clear the remaining mercenaries, Zara held the most dangerous man in Atlanta, knowing that the blood and lace of this night had finally sealed a vow that no contract could ever break. The aftermath of the battle left the Minyi estate bathed in a haunting mix of emergency strobes and the soft, rising light of a new dawn. The air was finally clear of smoke, replaced by the crisp, earthy scent of wet pavement and ozone. Dominic Vale sat on the marble floor of the foyer, his zip-tied hands trembling, his eyes darting toward the shadows where Minyi's enforcers stood like silent gargoyles. He was no longer a tycoon. He was a ghost of a man whose currency of fear had finally been devalued. Minyi stood over him, his shoulder bandaged and his black shirt torn, yet he had never looked more grounded or authoritative. He didn't use a weapon to end it. Instead, he pulled a thick folder from the desk, evidence of Dominic's offshore money laundering and the human cost of his shipping mergers. With a single nod, Minyi handed the file to a waiting contact from the Federal Bureau. Dominic wouldn't be dying in the mud. He would be buried alive in a cell, his reputation and fortune dismantled piece by piece, until nothing remained of the man who thought he could own a woman's soul. "Take him," Minyi said, his voice a low, final vibration. "And make sure the world knows that the debt he claimed is void. From this day forward, the Akoi name is under the protection of the Kang family." As the authorities dragged a screaming Dominic into the light of the morning, Minyi turned his back on the chaos. He walked toward Zara, who was standing on the grand staircase. She had shed the ruined wedding gown, now dressed in a sleek, powerful black suit that Minyi's staff had prepared. Her posture was no longer that of a fugitive. She stood with her shoulders back, her gaze sharp and alert, mirroring the man who had risked everything to keep her. "The underworld is waiting for a statement," Minyi murmured, stopping at the base of the stairs and extending his hand. "They saw the smoke. They heard the gunfire. They need to know who is in charge of this city." Zara looked at his hand, the hand that had cleaned her knuckles in the moonlight and pulled the trigger in the rain. She placed her hand in his, her fingers interlacing with his in a silent, unbreakable vow. "Then let's not keep them waiting." They didn't hide in the safe house. Instead, they drove to the Lotus Club, the very place where their worlds had collided. The high-ranking captains of the city's most dangerous syndicates were already there, gathered in the dim, neon-lit lounge, their faces etched with uncertainty. They had heard the rumors of the runaway Maid and the Ice King's fall. When the doors swung open, the room went dead silent. Minyi walked in first, but he didn't head for the head of the table alone. He stepped aside, his hand resting possessively and respectfully on the small of Zara's back, ushering her to sit in the chair beside his, a seat that had remained empty for 7 long years. "There is a new rule in this city," Minyi announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the club with the weight of a decree. "The woman beside me is not a guest. She is not a maid. She is the mind that saw through the tycoon's play and the hand that held the line when the glass broke. Zara Akoi is the partner of this house. To move against her is to move against me. To disrespect her is to invite a war you cannot win." The captains looked from Minyi's hardened, disciplined face to Zara's calm, luminous presence. They saw the transformation, the way the vulnerability of the Maid had been forged into the quiet power of a queen. One by one, the men bowed their heads. It was a recognition of a new era. Later that evening, as the city lights twinkled like a kingdom of diamonds beneath them, Minyi and Zara stood on the balcony of the club. The 3 years of silence were gone, replaced by a partnership built on a love that had been tested in fire. Minyi looked at her, his expression finally breaking into a smile, the second one in 7 years, and this time it was full of peace. "I used to think the silence protected you," he admitted, pulling her into the warmth of his chest.